In this video, I'm going to be building the 1/144th scale BF109 E4 from Beacon Models. David from the local club asked me if I would be up for another 144th scale challenge, and as I really liked the look of these brand new Beacon model kits, I jumped at the chance. While the surface detail may not be up to the likes of Sweet model, the details are still pretty nice. If you'd like to see these kits in more detail, Matt over at Model Minutes has got a few unboxings, so those would be well worth checking out. The only thing that really didn't look so great were the clear parts. It looks like they weren't properly polished on the tooling end, which is a shame. But the kit does come with some canopy masks, which will be very useful in this scale. The decals look really nice and they're in perfect register, but that's to be expected from Cartograph. I also managed to blag a 3D printed Kugelwagen and a figure. These files I do believe are available on the Beacon Models website. And the detail, especially on the pilot figure, is fantastic. Anyway, that's enough jibber jabber, let's get into the build. There is detail in the cockpit, but there's not a lot of it, to be expected in this scale. So the two main parts were glued together and then sprayed with MRP RLM02. This colour was carried over to the sideboards of the cockpit. And that was pretty much how far I took the painting and weathering of the interior of this tiny plane. The opening for an ME-109 cockpit is already notoriously small. In 144th scale it's just ridiculous. So I made the executive decision that you're not going to see it anyway and closed the fuselage halves. The glue I'm using, as usual, is VMS fast setting styrene cement. The next step was to marry the two fuselage halves and the wing assembly. The fit on both of these parts were great. Next up, I tidied up some of the seam work on the fuselage halves with some soft sanding sticks. Next up, I glued in place the engine cowling. I decided to rescribe some of the panel irons on the top and bottom of the ME-109's fuselage. For this, I used a CMK razor saw and a steady hand. Any burrs and surface irregularities were then smoothed over with some VMS cement. To make the clear parts more palatable, I did try polishing out some of the texture with some cutting compound and a cotton bud. While this did make the canopy a little bit better looking, I did run into one problem. I must have been overzealous with my polishing or a bit too firm of hand because I did end up cracking the canopy I was going to use. That's not ideal, but there are two other canopies I can use on the sprue. It looks like there are two earlier types of canopy to use. Not ideal, but it'll do the job. The spare canopy was glued in place with VMS TransferFix 6K. I really like this stuff because you can clean up any excess with some universal weathering carrier, and it doesn't fog up any clear parts. Ideal. The canopy framing was masked off and then given a provisional layer of RLM02. The whole airframe was then primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Mahogany. This was thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner and sprayed at around 15 psi. If you haven't tried them, Mr. Surfacer is some of the best primers on the market. Now they are a lacquer, so they do smell a bit, but the result is brilliant. Also, because it's a lacquer, you can sand it without peeling off any paint. Because of how small this model is, I decided to sand the primer down lightly to make sure there were no surface blemishes whatsoever. Once I was happy with the result, I gave the model another light layer of primer. Right, let's get some painting done. For the underside, I used MRP RLM 65. Usually I wouldn't thin MRP, but because I was working to such a fine scale, I did decide to thin the paint a little bit. I added around 20% thinner to the paint, just to help the flow. The entire lower surface was black based, or brown based, building up the shadows and highlights with the opacity of the light blue. Once I'd finished the underside work with the RLM 65, I decided I wasn't too happy with the tones that were showing through. I think because the brown is a warm tone and the blue is a cool tone, they slightly clash. So out with the black primer. Once the whole airframe had been primed again, it was time to start that black basing once more. Using the same paint ratios as before, I repeated the process. Once the paint on the underside had dried, I added the white tactical markings. For this I used MRP white and a wide piece of masking tape. Right, let's get to work on the upper camouflage colours. Because this model was so small, I masked off all of the areas I wanted to remain blue. Here I used a mix of tape and VMS masking fluid. I then roughly freehanded MRP's RLM-02 to create the camouflage shapes on the upper surfaces. Again, this was done in a rough black base sort of style. Because the camo demarcations on the Dayfighter scheme are hard-edged, I used some tape to carefully mask off my RLM-02 sections, before painting the darker colour MRP RLM-71. Because I wanted the challenge, I specifically chose an out-of-the-box paint scheme to make sure I had some hard 144th scale models to do. This was definitely the most nerve-wracking part of the build. But using MRP thinned 1:1 this time, paired with my 0.15 hardness Steenbeck, it wasn't that bad, but it still was quite a challenge. I had to be careful not to put too much paint down and cause any runs. And I also had to really limit the motion of my hand to make sure paint didn't get anywhere I didn't want it. And the result came out okay. I was fairly pleased, but just don't look too closely. Next up, it's time to add some decals. To match my references, I had to use the add-on Beacon Models decal set. The decals in the kit catered to only one scheme, so I had to get the sheet to make this build historically accurate. As usual, the decals were carefully cut out of the sheet. They were then dropped in some warm water only for a few seconds. If you leave the decals in the water for too long, the adhesive can disappear, causing problems later down the line. And to make sure the decals were extra stuck down, I used some VMS Decal Set and Fix. The quality on both sheets of decals was really nice. They were really thin, which is essential in this scale. And they conformed the surface details really nicely. But of course, to make sure they were extra conformed, I did use some VMS decal softener. With the decals done, it's time to put the spinner on and do some detail painting. For the wheel wells, I mixed up an approximation of RLM-02 with Vallejo Russian Uniform Green and Green Grey. The tyres were then painted with AK 3rd Gen Smoke Black. For all my fine work like this, I usually use a 2.0 Kolinsky Sable. The one I'm using here is by Artis Opus. The landing gear was then carefully superglued into place. To protect the decals and hide some of the carrier film, the entire model was given a layer of VMS Satin Varnish HD. Once this was dry, it was time for an oil wash. And on this build, I'm going to go old school. Well, old school for me anyway. I'm going to use some Ultramarine and burnt umber artist oils to mix up a dark wash. This was thinned with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light and their fast drying oil medium. The wash was applied over all of the panel lines and details. In hindsight, I could have thinned the wash more, because it didn't flow very well, at least on the top surfaces. To make the wash less intense, I used more thinner for the undersides. This also helped the wash to flow a bit better. I cleaned off any excess wash with a cotton bud before sealing the model with a layer of VMS Matt Varnish. I didn't really want to go overboard with the weathering on this model, so I kept it light. For the final step on the aircraft, I wanted to add an aerial wire. I used Infini model ultrafine rigging wire. This is usually used for 1/700 ships, so it's perfect for this scale. This was glued in place with VMS superglue. Once the cable was fixed in place, I trimmed away the excess. Next up, I had to paint the accessories for the mini diorama I'm going to do. I didn't have the right kind of shade of Panzer grey for this Kugelwagen, so I mixed up my own. The layer lines are fairly visible here, but please remember the scale. This is absolutely tiny. I painted the glass areas on the Kubel with some smoke black. I had to be really careful here not to get any black on the previously painted grey. The canvas top was painted with Vallejo Russian uniform World War II. Next up was to paint the figure. This is going to be a small challenge. The flesh colours were based in Vallejo medium flesh, before mixing in some light flesh and giving him some highlights. This looks really stark, but at this scale it's best to exaggerate the details, otherwise they'll just get lost. The flight suit was base coated with Vallejo English uniform. I mixed some black with the English uniform, just a tiny speck of black, to add some shadows. For the highlights, I added some German camouflage beige to the English uniform. This was then painted on any of the areas of the uniform that might catch the sun. The strapping for the parachute was then painted with German camouflage beige. There's not a lot left to do to the figure, but I hope the little bit of extra time spent will help make him really pop. I designed and 3D printed a small base for the Messerschmitt to sit on. The shape and the text was done in Fusion 360, while I added some bumps and textures with Blender. This was primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Mahogany. Once everything was painted up, I added some very tiny tufts from AK Interactive. These are supposed to be self-adhesive, but I used PVA glue to make sure they stuck down nicely. I then used some Tamiya lacquer flat earth. This was to lighten up the mud tones and start blending the grass into the base. I then used a selection of greens to spray the grass. I always think it looks better to spray it rather than use the original colour. This allows you to add your own colourings and variations to the final result. Here I started off with a dark green, before moving on to a very light green to add some highlights. The whole composition was then given an ultra-thin mist of Tamiya flat earth. This was thinned around 10% paint to 90% thinner. This step will just help blend everything together. Next up, it was time to add some mud to the base. I used VMS EU Brown Earth Pigment. This was mixed with some Universal Weathering Carrier and some Alkyd binders. This was then brushed on around all the grass tufts. Because I used one of VMS's coarser pigments, this gave the mud a nice texture. With the lettering, I wanted to try something a bit different, and you can see where this is heading. I used some Mr. Metal Colour buffable chrome silver to pick out the lettering. This was then buffed to a supposedly shiny finish with a cotton bud. Unfortunately, it didn't work very well. So instead I brushed over some super metallic silver. This was thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner. Once the silver paint had dried, I brushed over the pigment mix from before. And once this had dried, I wiped away the excess with a cotton bud, leaving the silver lettering peeping out over the mud. I'm not 100% sure how it looks, but I thought it was a little bit different, so I just ran with it. And with that, the Kugelwagen, the Messerschmitt and the figure were placed on the base, and the build was complete. I'd like to thank everybody for their patience with me at the moment. My mojo is still really low, so I thought a small build like this might help kickstart it. Well, my mojo is still low, but I do have a nice model that I finished. It was a nice mix of easy to build with enough challenges to keep me interested. And I hope you like the end result. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my patrons for supporting my work. And I'd like to thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. My schedule is a bit all over the place at the minute, but there are videos coming. Anyway, thanks again for watching. I'm James from LPJ Models.